welcome to episode 29 of Tahrir Podcast. My guest today is Jean-Loup Samaan, and in this episode, we'll be discussing his book, New Military Strategies in the Gulf, the Mirage of Autonomy in Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar, which looks at, as the title implies, the evolving defense policies of these respective countries. Previously affiliated with the French Ministry of Defense, the NATO Defense College, and the UAE National Defense College, Jean-Loup is currently a senior research fellow at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative, and an associate research fellow with the French Institute of International Relations. So first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, welcome.
So, to ease things in, what's your relationship to the Gulf? How and when did it start, to lay some ground?
So you mean the personal relationship?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's a good starting point because I think the in many ways the book is first a personal project because I started working on the book when I lived in the Gulf and more specifically in Abu Dhabi. I lived in Abu Dhabi for 5 years. Between 2016 and 2021, I was working as associate professor in strategic studies in Abu Dhabi for the UAE National Defense College, so teaching to officers, diplomats, civil servants of the UAE. And before that, I was working, as you mentioned, with the NATO Defense College, and that's the moment where I first traveled to the Gulf. So my first encounter with the Gulf was around 2011, 2012, when back then there was not many people working on the Gulf because the center of Middle Eastern studies in many ways was still the Levant or Egypt, and I saw this new object, in a sense, new interest on the Gulf and in particular Gulf strategy booming in the following years. So that's how, at a personal level, I started looking at the Gulf.
So yeah, let's get into it. So if you could briefly put it, why is it that Gulf militaries have long been ineffective and weak or weakened?
Well, the answer goes back in history with the way the Gulf states were established in the first place, and at the time, let's say when you had the modern states in the UAE, Bahrain, and Qatar, there was a major concern. Which was the fear of a military coup. And not so long before, in the 50s, you had actually an attempted coup in Saudi Arabia that failed. And so there was the perception that powerful militaries, powerful armed forces would actually lead to the threat of a military coup. So in a very similar way to other regions of the world, the armed forces in the Gulf were not very powerful because there was the fear of their involvement in politics. That changed in different steps. First, there was the realization after the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in 1990, that took only a few days. If some of the people listening to the podcast are old enough to remember, the Iraqi army very quickly took control of Kuwait. And that was a major trauma for the Kuwaitis until today, but that was also a trauma for the other neighboring countries, because suddenly they realized that they needed to strengthen their security forces. That led to several decisions. The biggest one at the time was probably the strengthening, the expansion of military cooperation with Western countries, and in particular with the US. So that's the moment in the 90s where we saw the US becoming this major power, military power in the region, with the most controversial decision being the deployment of US troops in Saudi Arabia. But in addition to that, you had steadily ambitions also for the local armed forces. But that would take an additional 10, 15 years before, let's say, those countries decided to have greater autonomy in terms of military education, military industries, military training, and so on. So let's say that in the end of the 2000s, and in particular after the Arab Spring in 2011, that's really the moment where you saw that momentum for Gulf armed forces to take ownership of their security environment. And something which is very revealing is the operation in Yemen that started in 2015. In 2015, you have Saudi Arabia announcing this coalition that would intervene in Yemen. A few years before that, nobody would have believed that scenario, that you would have Gulf countries launching an intervention such as Yemen. We can discuss the effectiveness of the operation itself, but politically, to have Gulf states to decide that operation, that was quite unprecedented, and that signaled that new period where Gulf countries were to build their own military strategies.
And I don't think that's handled in the book or, falls within the realm of your expertise. But in the case of Qatar, for example, with Tamim having couped his father, Hamad, taking the reins from him in 2013, how does that unfold? Or in other words, where is the muscle here if the militaries are weakened? Or until this point, or in other words, until this point, the military had been weakened in Qatar.
Well, the interesting element here is the role of the political leader at the top. And you're right to point out that the relations between the armed forces and the political leadership in Qatar has been very different under Hamad, so the father, and Tamim, the current emir and president of Qatar. The first thing is that we have to remember that back in 1995, when Hamad took power in a bloodless coup in Doha, he faced resistance from the armed forces, and you had at the time a counter coup that was attempted by some elements of the military establishment in Qatar. That definitely played a role in Hamad's perception of the military and the relative neglect he had for anything that related to Qatar's military strategy. That's rather different now that his son is in power. Tamim has been trained just like his father, but Tamim has been trained at Sandhurst. He very quickly, even before becoming the emir, he was versed into military affairs. And we saw that after he became the emir in 2013, that he treated military affairs much more seriously. When I say military affairs here, I assume local military affairs, which is different from, let's say, cooperation with the US or European countries. In the case of Hamad, this was already a major element, the idea of having close ties to the Western countries, but there was no serious appetite to strengthen the local militaries on their own. With Tamim, that changed. There was a new wave of military reforms, in particular in terms of military education, the national service that was introduced in 2014. And in particular after the blockade in 2017. So after you had Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain deciding to close their borders with Qatar, that significantly led to this new Qatari perception of Qatari project of national security, and decided that Qatar needed to strengthen its own strategic autonomy. And the military aspect was a natural component of that project. So here, clearly, you see a combination of different elements where the political leader, depending on the style, depending on the history of his ties with the military, that will influence the way the national strategy, the national project for the armed forces has been evolving.
Yeah. And the book also raised the idea that Russian arms deals hardly make sense for Gulf countries on a technical sense. And he also argued that in addition to Russian deals, the Chinese military cooperation can also be counterintuitive. So leaving the Gulf, it leaves the Gulf ultimately more vulnerable, as you argue. So how is it that branching out and, the diversification of arms and military cooperation, how do they become counterintuitive in these cases?
Well, it's a great question, and there's a lot to unpack. Because as you point out, we discuss a lot about diversification of Gulf foreign policies these days. There's a lot of discussion about how the Gulf countries are non-aligned or multi-aligned, and that they want to have good relations with the US, good relations with Russia, with China, and so on. And that works to a certain extent. I think it's doable, it's sustainable at the diplomatic and maybe at the economic level. But in the military domain, that gets tricky. That gets tricky for very technical reasons, because it takes a long time to train soldiers on specific military systems. So, for instance, when countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar purchase fighter jets from the US, you have to understand that means for the next 10, 20 years, the pilots of their air forces will have to be trained in the US by US operators. So that's a significant investment. That's not just a financial investment, it's an investment on the training of your forces. Now, if you have a situation, which is already the case, where you have different fighter jets, for instance, in Qatar, they operate American fighter jets, they operate British fighter jets, they operate French fighter jets. That means that the process I just described, you have to get it for each system. It's still, it's complex, but it's still feasible when you have countries like the US, UK, and France, which are NATO countries. So because they are NATO countries, they are used to work together. You have some operational standards that exist that allow these systems to work together. That's not the case when you have Russian systems or Chinese systems. So that's the moment it gets really tricky, because when the UAE announces that it will buy Chinese fighter jets, even though we're talking about light fighter jets, which are not exactly the same type of fighter jets they buy from the US or France, it still implies a lot of uncertainties regarding the training, because that means that suddenly you will have parts of the Air Force in the UAE which are, let's say, Western-oriented, and other part of the Air Force which would be Chinese-oriented. There's a lot of unknowns also regarding the security, the sensitivity of technology, because the US is very careful when it comes to its systems not to expose them to, let's say, potential Russian or Chinese interference. And that's the reason why they are very concerned, very worried that if Gulf states start buying Russian, Chinese military systems, that could compromise their own technologies. So that's the reason why this idea of diversification in the military domain, that doesn't really work, in the sense that, as you said, there is the idea of vulnerabilities. It creates new dependence for the Gulf states. That means that they may be able to say we have good relations with everyone, but operationally, that means that they have new dependencies with the Russians, with the Chinese, and it doesn't really decrease their reliance, let's say, on external security partners. So that's why in the book I argue that in the end that creates more uncertainties, more questions than provides answers to the Gulf objective of strategic autonomy.
But I feel like this argument kind of exclusively addresses fighter jets because of the huge commitment that needs to be there for them to operate. But what about missiles? Because in the 2017, when the embargo started on Qatar, and during their national day, they had the parade. They unveiled the Chinese SY-400 system. So doesn't this ultimately, besides the fact that it acts as a deterrent, doesn't it also, convey some layer of strategic autonomy or independence, to say the least? And also, before we get into that, could you briefly explain what strategic autonomy is, so listeners could pick up on it?
Right. Okay. So let's start indeed with the concept of strategic autonomy, which I explained at the beginning of the book, which is a concept that emerged in the 20th century, and that derives from the discussion in the 50s on non-alignment. The idea was in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa that countries which were not great powers, countries which were not middle powers, just small states, needed to have their own strategies and needed to build their own agency. The idea basically is, how can you make sure when you're a rather small country, how can you make sure that you're not exposed to the pressures from great powers such as the US, China, or in the past, during the Cold War, the USSR. And this debate came back in the public sphere in the last 10 years, in particular during the Trump presidency. We saw that in Europe, in Asia, where suddenly a lot of the countries which relied on the US for their security started wondering what happens if, under a Trump presidency, the US decides that it is no longer complying with its commitments. That what happens if you're a European country that relies on the US for your security, and that the US just leaves Europe, if US withdraw from NATO. So suddenly strategic autonomy came back, and we saw that also in the Gulf during that same period, for rather different reasons. There were, but the first element, the first trigger was definitely the Gulf perception that the US was leaving, that the US was no longer the global leader that it used to be. That started under the Obama administration, when we saw very difficult relations between Gulf states and the US. So this idea of strategic autonomy basically means to strengthen your own capabilities, diplomatic, military, economic capabilities, to make sure that you can conduct your foreign policy on your own terms, that you will not be dependent or relying on an external partner. So that's the initial idea. So, and that's the reason I say that you may want to reduce your reliance on Western security partners by diversifying with China and Russia, but that doesn't mean that you will get a better situation for your strategic autonomy. That only means that you multiply your external dependence. You don't actually empower or strengthen your local capabilities through that process. So that's to go back to the previous debate. Now, regarding the domain that you mentioned, which is missiles, and you mentioned the Chinese missile that the Qataris displayed after the blockade in 2017. And one of the reasons why the Qataris, just like the Saudis before, went for China to procure missiles is basically because the Americans or the Europeans refused to sell them missiles. And that goes against several commitments from Western countries regarding the transfer of missile technologies. So in terms of non-proliferation norms. So the first reason was a very pragmatic reason. They could not get that from the Americans, so they got it from the Chinese. Now, what I described with regards to the fighter jets, you have the same situation when it comes to missiles. And let's take, for instance, the case of air defense systems. And this is a topic that has been a major topic, in particular in the UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, because those are countries that face regularly the threat of rockets, missiles, either from Iran or more recently from the Houthis in Yemen. We saw that in the last 5-6 years, how Houthis have been able to fire rockets, missiles on Saudi Arabia and on the UAE. So one of the things the Emiratis, the Saudis, and the Qataris have been doing is to buy air defense systems from the Americans mostly. So they have bought Patriot missile batteries, which are able to intercept incoming missiles and rockets. And they also bought another system called the THAAD system. But in addition to that, more recently, Saudi Arabia and the UAE discussed with Russia the idea of buying the S-400 system, which is in a very short way the equivalent or the competitor to the Patriot system. So that would be a Russian system that is able to intercept incoming missiles. The problem with that is that obviously the Americans were not pleased and put pressure on the Saudis and Emiratis not to go further on this. It's not just a matter of diplomatic relations. It's not just a matter of business interests. Of course, there are these dimensions that at play, but there is also an operational dimension. When you have an air defense system in your country, you have to think about it as one system that is plugged to a broader network, meaning that your interceptor has to be connected to the broader defense network. It works when you have American military systems, because again, you have the regional central command, the U.S. central command in the region that will be able to provide you with the data that you need. But if you're operating with a Russian system, that Russian system is going to be disconnected from the other systems. That's, again, I'm going to use a terrible analogy, but that's as if you're a Mac, an Apple customer, you're buying everything with Apple, and suddenly you want to buy just one item with HP. Suddenly this item is going to be disconnected from the rest because the American products have a lot of restrictions that come with them. So you will not be able to use that Russian system in the most efficient way. That's the reason why, at the operational reason, putting the politics aside, it doesn't really make sense to have this mix of, let's say, American, Russian, Chinese systems. So I'm sorry if I got into a long explanation on that, but I thought this might be necessary to get the details right for the people listening to us to understand why there's a contradiction in the strategic autonomy here.
And I think this equation is one that cannot be ultimately balanced out.
Well, the one way to balance that, and that's a project that is ongoing, is to strengthen your own local industry. That's something we saw in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, less so in Qatar, even though they have also a project of local and defense industry. But the logic to build and to strengthen your local defense industry is to avoid this type of scenarios. It is to avoid the situation where you have Washington telling you, we don't want you to buy that Russian system. If you have your own technology, if you have your own industry, well, you're free to define your own security restrictions and so on. So for many reasons, countries find the idea of having their own local defense industry attractive. It's definitely an efficient instrument to empower your sovereignty. So that's one way to address that, even though, and we can go back to that, it's also a very expensive option. It's to build your own defense industry takes time, and it takes a lot of investments. Not a lot of countries these days around the world have the resources to build and to sustain their own defense industry, because it's still much cheaper to buy products which are built, designed by the Americans or by the Chinese, and you buy them off the shelf. It's much cheaper to do that than to develop your own systems.
All right. So before we get into the Yemen War, could you maybe briefly explain, how it took place, how it started, and so forth?
Yeah. So the Yemen War, and I'll have to be short on this because we could spend several hours. But basically, in 2014, and in a way, it was some local reactions to the Arab revolts of 2011. So after 2011, you had the former president Saleh, that was removed. A national dialogue started in Yemen that didn't really succeed, and by 2014, there was a clear indication that Yemen was going back to a kind of a civil war. So you had at that time the Houthis, and this is a podcast, we cannot show maps, but the Houthis, which were coming from the north, started an offensive going south and going to Sana'a, the capital. Very quickly, the government that was in place got toppled. And the government basically left. The members of the government left for Saudi Arabia. So by the end of 2014, there was no more a government in Yemen. The Houthis were controlling large parts of the country. Then by March 2015, there were indications that the Houthis were going as far as Aden, so in the south of the country, and with the idea of controlling the access, the coastal access of Yemen. That triggered the decision of Saudi Arabia to launch the intervention, so the operation in Yemen. There are several things here. First, this was an intervention that was approved at the level of the UN Security Council, and it had a very simple but very ambitious objective, which was to remove the Houthis and to put the government back inside Yemen. So meaning that those members of the government that were in exile, that were in Saudi Arabia, would go back to Yemen, and the Houthis would be defeated on the military battleground. That was the political objective. To do that at the military level, and we have to keep in mind that 2015, Mohammed bin Salman had just arrived as Deputy Crown Prince and Minister of Defense. So this was just 2 months after his father became the king of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia decided to build a coalition that included Gulf states, as well as several other Arab states, such as Morocco, Jordan. The most of the fighting that happened until today involved Saudi Arabia, UAE, Sudan, but less the other Gulf states. There was mostly a modest contribution from Qatar. Qatar was part of the coalition until the blockade in 2017. And the other Gulf states mostly provided limited contributions. So that's the setting for the background on the war. So that's how it started. But and I don't know if you want also to discuss how it ended, or at least it is currently evolving. But basically, since 2016, 2017, this is a war of attrition, where you don't have major victories on the battlefield. The Houthis have been able to maintain their hold on some areas of the country. They are not able to control the whole territory, but they are strong enough to prevent an alternative, meaning that they are able to prevent the return of a government that would be ruling without them. So it's impossible on the battlefield today, realistically, to consider a transition without considering the Houthis in that transition. And that's why I mentioned earlier the initial political objective that Saudi Arabia had in 2015. For a long time, Saudi Arabia dismissed any idea of discussing with the Houthis because that was going against its political objective. The idea was you get rid of the Houthis on the military battlefield. You don't talk to them. But that changed because basically after 5-6 years, you saw a huge fatigue, frustration on the Gulf coalition. So right now, we see clear pragmatism, realism on the side of Saudi Arabia and others. They just want to get rid of or to leave Yemen. So that's why the objectives have clearly evolved in the last years.
And it appears that Emiratis were more efficient on the Yemen battlefield, at least at first, yet lost about 150 soldiers, nearly 50 of which in only one ambush. So how do you think Emirati and Saudi performance in the Yemen War compare? As also civilian casualty wise, taking in consideration their efforts to reform, modernize, and military education and so forth.
Right. So several things here. The first thing is that, as you said, the military strategy of Saudi Arabia and UAE inside Yemen were very different. Very different. First, because Saudi Arabia relied mostly on airstrikes. The idea was that the Saudi Air Force would conduct airstrikes, and that this campaign would be enough to get rid of the Houthis. That was the belief in the first years of the conflict, that you could just launch an air campaign, and that this would be enough to solve the Houthi issue. In terms of boots on the ground, the Saudi soldiers stayed mostly around their border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. This was very different in the case of the UAE. The UAE had different objectives, and they were operating in different areas. Eventually, the UAE, in, let's say, the second part of 2015, 2016, launched amphibious operations, meaning that they launched operations that were conducted from their military bases in Eastern Africa, and that targeted the coastal towns in Yemen. These were very ambitious operations, and initially they were met with very positive assessments from NATO officials, from US officials. A lot of the people I interviewed back then were considering that the UAE military performance was similar to some of the best NATO armed forces. That was the initial assessment. That assessment changed for different reasons afterwards. First, we started hearing that there had been some deals that had been made with local tribes and sometimes with terrorist organizations before the military intervention. So, in a way, when the interventions occurred, there were already terrorist organizations leaving that area because there had been deals made prior to that. But maybe more importantly, the thing is that the UAE struggled also to secure those areas. Even though they were able to conquer them, they very often struggle to keep those regions under their control. So the reason why the UAE suffered that amount of casualties that you mentioned is basically because they had a much bigger military footprint on the ground than the Saudis. And on that, I think it's important also to realize the social aspect, that this was, at least in 2016, 2017, for the Emirati society, this was a major phenomenon, because we're talking about a small country. You have about 1 million citizens in the UAE. So when you have 100 soldiers who get killed in action in Yemen, you can assume that given the social fabric of the country, everyone knows someone or some family that lost someone in Yemen. And that's the reason in 2016, the UAE government created what they call the Martyrs' Day. This holiday which occurs every year, one day before the National Day, and which is dedicated to the memory of the soldiers that were killed, not just in Yemen, but in any conflict for the UAE. So that's, in a way, the reason why you had such a significant number of casualties. Finally, on the civilian casualties, and I think this is probably the most important aspect, that eventually Yemen was a humanitarian and is still a humanitarian tragedy. Something that I say in the book is that this was not done on purpose. I don't think any serious expert observer would say that the Saudi coalition wanted that humanitarian disaster. But in a way, it's like, if I use another analogy, I think this is the Vietnam of the Gulf states. It's actually something that one commander of the UAE Presidential Guard used as an analogy. He said Yemen is the Vietnam of Gulf states. And I think it's true because for many reasons. First, they also believed, like the Americans back in Vietnam, that an air campaign would get rid of the Houthis. They realized that the Houthis were much more resistant, much more resilient than they expected. The other thing that they didn't realize, didn't anticipate, is the cost of the war for their public image. I think one of the reasons why the UAE in 2019 decided to withdraw its forces is because Abu Dhabi realized it was damaging its public image very significantly. That the fact the UAE armed forces, along the Saudi armed forces, were involved in all these cases of collateral damages, all these cases of civilian innocents getting killed or suffering from the naval blockade. This was terrible for public relations. So that's also something they discovered, because, again, we're talking about countries that had not been involved in major wars before on their own. So again, the analogy of Vietnam, the Gulf states lost kind of a strategic innocence through the war in Yemen. Having said that, the problem now is how do they solve that issue? How do they find a reasonable exit strategy? But that's probably a topic for another discussion.
But what's the discourse like? Since your time in the UAE, you probably know what's the public discourse and how the government looks at it. Do they acknowledge that it was not necessarily a military success, or is there a different thing being pushed for here? I would assume in Saudi Arabia, they don't accept it as a disaster. But how is it like in the UAE?
No, yeah, and I think in both cases, you will not find a government official or a local newspaper that would openly, explicitly say that Yemen was a disaster. And to be fair with our Emirati and Saudi friends, it's the same thing for NATO in Afghanistan. I worked for NATO for 5 years. Nobody at the time would acknowledge that the Taliban were on their way back to power. I saw, in a sense, the same state of denial from NATO officials than you can see in the Gulf for Yemen. It's painful, especially when you lose soldiers. It's painful to accept that the operation is a failure, especially if you go further than this and you you realize that the security situation today might be worse than in 2014. Because in 2014, there was not a threat from rockets or missiles from the Houthis like we have today. So in a sense, the security situation when you're in Abu Dhabi today is much more preoccupying than it was in 2014. So it's a painful assessment, and I cannot blame them for not reaching that, at least in the public domain. One thing that the book highlights at the end is that the one key challenge, I think, for the coming years for those countries, for Saudi Arabia and UAE, because those were the countries that were mostly involved in Yemen, is to launch this process of lessons learned. I mentioned earlier Vietnam. After Vietnam, you had a tremendous soul-searching moment for the U.S. armed forces. I mean, this was an existential crisis, not just for the U.S. armed forces, but for the U.S. society. I mean, this was back in the 70s, a huge moment of existential crisis in the U.S. In the case of the Gulf Armed Forces, I think after Yemen, it will be very important for them to assess what are the lessons from their involvement inside Yemen, the lessons from their engagement against the Houthis, the way they combined airstrikes and amphibious operations, support to the local forces, usually non-state actors, as we saw in the South. So all of that, we need to see, I mean, this will be done probably, if it's not already done, in the private domain. We won't see that occurring publicly, but at least there is a need for that process, because that will allow them to adapt and to get the military reforms right for the next time.
So the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, appears to have lost its potency with the 2017-2021 Qatar embargo and the very most recent Saudi Emirati clash/proxy war in Sudan. Also, in light of the March 2011 put-down of the Manama protests in Bahrain by the Peninsula Shield Force, the PSF, Quwat Dir al-Jazira, mainly Saudi Emirati task force. But there were actually Qatari officers also sent to put down the uprising, according to Colonel Abdullah al-Ajri. It seemed as though until that point, March 2011, united they were, at least in regards to quashing internal threats to their non-democratic rule. And as you put it in page 150, quote, the ability of the GCC to operate is fundamentally eroded by Saudi, Emirati, and Qatari unilateral agendas. But it is also this very weakness that Gulf rulers use as justification for their aspirations towards greater self-reliance. As a result, the current dynamic does not bode well with regard to the likelihood of a future clash between Gulf states, be it similar or worse to the one witnessed between 2017 and 2021, end quote. So where do you think that puts the GCC going forward?
Well, the simple answer would be that the future of the GCC is going to be like his past, meaning that first, the GCC was always weak in terms of policy making. And very often you hear Gulf officials or even Gulf scholars praising the GCC and dismissing any critical view on the GCC. But the reality is that if you try to name concrete realizations of the GCC in terms of foreign policy, in terms of defense policy, even in terms of economic policies, it's very hard to find something that actually was implemented by the GCC. So that has been the case since the beginning, since the creation of the GCC in the 80s. But in addition to that, in addition to this traditional reluctance, let's say, of Gulf states to strengthen regional cooperation, the thing I explain in the book is that these policies of strategic autonomy are not by design going to favor regional cooperation, because if the goal is to strengthen your own autonomy, you're going to be suspicious, or you're going to be very careful about cooperating with your neighbor, and you may sometimes find occasional agreements, but on strategic affairs, it's going to be a very transactional approach. That's something that is, I would say, fundamental in the relations between the Gulf states, and that's also the reason. I mean, you mentioned the ongoing reports of tensions, disputes between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But in a way, if we're trying to have a historical perspective, this is only surprising if you were expecting cooperations like the US and the United Kingdom. I mean, Saudi Arabia and the UAE had an alliance, official alliance, but they had not solved, for instance, their border dispute. These are two countries that historically have always looked at each other suspiciously. Doesn't mean that they see themselves as enemies. I don't think this is the way they perceive themselves, but I think it's more like a pragmatic, realist approach where they may cooperate on some aspects occasionally, but that doesn't mean that they are friends, because in international relations, you don't have any friends. You only have interests. And at the current time, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi don't really share common interests on specific topics. I think in Yemen that actually was clear that they disagreed on some aspects. We saw that also on the economic competition, which is probably the most important one right now. But again, I mean, this relates to the idea of strategic autonomy. This relates also to the fact that the Gulf environment there isn't like a regional security architecture. There isn't a process of regional integration like you would see in Europe, or let's say Southeast Asia with ASEAN. So this is much more defined by the national level and from time to time bilateral cooperation.
In the book, you also address military education in the Gulf. And you also highlight the fact that in some cases, the numbers of people that make it through that, the numbers of people who get accredited through these institutions are quite disappointing. There was one case where I think a handful of officers only graduated with tens or perhaps 100 or more, only got, certificates, not the masters that the institution was intended for. So what do you think this puts Gulf country institutions going forward?
Well, the issue you describe is the issue of the standards and the gap between the objectives of a reform and its realization. The military education reform that started in the Gulf in the last decade were very ambitious, and the idea was that Qatari officers, Emirati officers, Saudi officers would follow standards that were mostly coming from US or UK military education systems. And as you mentioned, the problem was that in many cases, the officers didn't meet or didn't match those requirements. I think, and one of the things I heard from several people I interviewed, I think it's going to be a matter of generation. If we want to be positive on this, we can say that the current generation is not the one that will really see the results of this reform. It's going to be those that join the armed forces today and that will go through this process. Because the problem, and you see that in any domain of Gulf policies, not just military policies, but in the Gulf, you have these huge ambitious projects, objectives of building institutions, building programs in just a few years. And it may work on some aspects, but usually when it involves human learning, it takes a much longer time. It takes a much longer time to have your manpower, your human force able to follow those objectives. So one thing I kept seeing during the research for the book was this gap between the objectives and how far the reform had been in reality.
All right. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think we covered most of it. Thank you for giving me the time. I hope I didn't scare your listeners with military details. The book is trying to connect, let's say, military operational matters with a more political, strategic context. And I hope those who listen will understand this, the purpose, that it's not technical just for the purpose of being technical, but it's to look at how when we discuss diversification of foreign policy, Gulf strategic autonomy, and so on, how does that translate at the military level? So, but again, thank you for taking the time or allowing me to take that time to discuss all of that.
Definitely, of course. Jean-Loup's book, New Military Strategies in the Gulf, The Mirage of Autonomy in Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar. I'll leave a link to it in the description, and I highly recommend you get yourself a copy. It's very well written, and it's actually easy to read and extremely informative. So,
thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you for your time.